but to look at Job as a whole was something I hadn't done for years. I had to do it in my college days because the book of Job was one of our set texts for the Old Testament paper at the London University Bachelor of Divinity degree. And when I looked at the book of Job then, I was looking at it from an armchair perspective. Let me highlight that word armchair, because what I was doing was looking at the book of Job from a technical aspect. It's an interesting text. Arguably, it's one of the oldest texts in the Old Testament canon. And it's not an easy text either, because the original manuscripts have been destroyed or abused over the years, and quite honestly there are parts of the book of Job where we're not sure exactly what the original text said. Our translators have taken some educated guesses at it over the years, and we'll need to look at one or two of those variant readings when we come to them. It's good to remember that whatever translation we're using to understand the book of Job, it is only a translation. It's not the original Masoretic text in Hebrew. I'm going to be using the New International Version. I'm also recommending that if you haven't studied the book of Job in detail before and you want to stay awake, you use the Message version. Because although I'm not a great fan of the Message, by and large, when you look at the book of Job, it does help you make sense of some of the obscure passages. Someone once said of Wagner's operas, there are some wonderful moments and some awful half hours. And I think there's a sense in which that's true of the book of Job. There are some wonderful verses. Perhaps the best known verse comes in chapter 19, set wonderfully to music in Handel's Messiah. For I know that my Redeemer liveth. You know that one, don't you? But there are some pretty awful half hours as well. And what we will discover in the book of Job is that there are, alongside the highlights, some very difficult passages. We're not going to avoid all of those difficult passages, though you'll be glad to know this isn't going to be a verse by verse or even chapter by chapter exposition. If we were going to do that, it would take us ages. Historians tell us that John Calvin preached through the book of Job on one occasion, and it took him 76 sermons to do that. Well, we've got 4 weeks. So what we're really doing is trying, in pre-decimal terminology, to put a quart into a pint pot. I feel when I look at the book of Job, it's a little bit like trying to scale Mount Everest using a stepladder. Yes, at the top of the stepladder, you're heading in the right direction, but you haven't really got to the summit. And I'm so conscious that as we look through these 4 studies together, we're only going to be scratching the surface. But what I've endeavoured to do is to pick out the main themes of the book of Job and give us some keys to understanding. A little bit of homework, if you're up for it. I would suggest that you read the book of Job in its entirety, but please not at one sitting, because if it's a wet Wednesday when you read the book of Job, all you want to do at the end is go out and find the nearest bus and jump under it. It's not a book for the faint-hearted. Now, I've given you 4 titles, and they've been wonderfully produced in the notice sheet. And the first one today says, "So you think you've got problems." So without further ado, let's turn to the book of Job. It comes immediately prior to the book of Psalms, and we're going to read the first 2 chapters. The book of Job, chapter 1, verse 1. In the land of Uz, there lived a man whose name was Job. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and he owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen and 500 donkeys. I tell you by way of a little bit of information, I've got a couple of donkeys in a field behind me in Rev'd, and when they start making a noise, my word, it's an awful racket. Just imagine 500 donkeys braying all at once. Not surprisingly, he had a large number of servants. He was the greatest man among all the people of the East. His sons used to take turns holding feasts in their homes, and they would invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. When a period of feasting had run its course, Job would send and have them purified. Early in the morning, he would sacrifice a burnt offering for each of them, thinking, perhaps my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. This was Job's regular custom. One day the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them. The Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" "Satan," answered the Lord, "from roaming through the earth and going back and forth in it." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil." "Does Job fear God for nothing?" Satan replied. "Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? You have blessed the work of his hands, so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land. But stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." The Lord said to Satan, "Very well then, everything he has is in your hands, but on the man himself do not lay a finger." Then Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. One day when Job's sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, "The oxen were ploughing and the donkeys were grazing nearby, and the Sabaeans attacked and carried them off. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, "The fire of God fell from the sky and burned up the sheep and the servants, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, "The Chaldeans formed 3 raiding parties and swept down on your camels and carried them off. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, yet another messenger came and said, "Your sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house, when suddenly a mighty wind swept in from the desert and struck the 4 corners of the house. It collapsed on them, and they are dead. And I am the only one," you can complete this verse, can't you, "who has escaped to tell you." At this, Job got up and tore his robe and shaved his head. Then he fell to the ground in worship and said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised." In all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. On another day, the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them to present himself before him. And the Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered the Lord, "From roaming through the earth and going back and forth in it." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. And he still maintains his integrity, though you incited me against him to ruin him without any reason." "Skin for skin," Satan replied. "A man will give all he has for his own life, but stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to your face." The Lord said to Satan, "Very well then, he is in your hands, but you must spare his life." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and afflicted Job with painful sores from the soles of his feet to the top of his head. Then Job took a piece of broken pottery and scraped himself with it as he sat among the ashes. His wife said to him, "Are you still holding on to your integrity? Curse God and die." He replied, "You are talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" In all this, Job did not sin in what he said. When Job's three friends, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite, heard about all the troubles that had come upon him, they set out from their homes and met together by agreement to go and sympathize with him and comfort him. When they saw him from a distance, they could hardly recognize him. They began to weep aloud, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads. Then they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him, because they saw how great his suffering was. Do you know, I need a drink after that. What a passage of scripture. And can you wonder why we preachers often fight shy of it? What can we say today by way of introduction? Well, our title is So You Think You've Got Troubles. And I think whatever else Job was having, he was certainly having a bad hair day. But we mustn't make the mistake of thinking this is a typical story. 2 things I want to say by way of introduction to help us focus our thinking. The first is this, that the book of Job is a very long book, 42 chapters in fact. And much of this book does go round in circles. Commentators speak of the different cycles of speeches. We will see next time, as we examine the speeches of these 3 comforters in a little more detail, that much of what they said is repetitive. You feel as you're going through their speeches that you've heard it all before, and in a sense you have. Yes, there are developments in speeches as they try their best to somehow comfort Job, but there's an awful lot of repetition. And you could be excused for thinking that you could cut out much of this repetition. Cut to the chase, as they say today. Get to the heart of the matter. What is the book of Job really all about? Why all this rigmarole of these 3 friends? Well, to be accurate, there's actually 4 friends, because there's a man called Elihu who comes on the scene in chapter 32, and would you believe he has 7 whole chapters to himself? He gets an awful lot of space. And at the end of it all, God says what these friends have spoken is a lot of hot air. And we could say, paraphrasing it, that some of the book of Job is a load of old rubbish. Though people like me who believe in the inspiration of Scripture would probably balk at that assessment. But it's a very long book. And the issues that Job deals with are complicated issues. Where is God in all the suffering? If you think you can put the answer on the back of a postcard, you've got another thing coming. The book of Job is one of the longest books in the canon of Scripture. And I think quite deliberately, the arguments are involved and intricate and are spun out in some detail. Because at the very least, God is saying, look, this is a big issue. It's a very difficult issue to deal with. And anyone who comes along today and says, I know exactly why there's suffering in the world, is misleading you. The second thing I want to say, on the heels of the book of Job is a long book, is the book of Job is an old book. Interestingly, Job was not a member of the covenant people of Israel. He was, to put it bluntly, a foreigner, a Gentile. In the very first verse, we're told that he came from the land of Uz. Now, where the land of Uz was, to a certain extent, is anyone's guess. Scholars have tended to equate it with the land of Edom, which was one of the historic nations surrounding Israel in what today would be Jordan. It was a desert land. And obviously the book of Job reflects nomadic culture. Here is a man who has huge flocks and herds and a whole army of servants to look after them. But the picture seems to be that Job is a man who roams around this desert region as a nomadic character. A very old book. And what we want to draw from this today is not only that the issue of where is God in all the suffering, a rather complicated one, and we're not going to give superficial answers. It's also an ancient one. It's an issue that's wider than the issue that faces people who believe in the God of Israel. Now, if I had a penny for everyone who said to me over the years, I'd love to believe in God, I'd love to believe that he's a God of goodness, I'd love to believe that he's a God of power, but why on earth, if God is in control, is the world in such a hell of a mess? Have you never heard that question as well? I have done on many occasions. And that's a question that transcends just believing people. It's a question that is common, in a sense, to all humanity. And if you look at the great religions of the world, you will see that each one in its own and different way has tried to account for the presence of evil in the world. When you look at creation, it's a kind of two-edged sword, isn't it? It's ambiguous. If I can explain what I mean, that there is so much goodness in the world, so much beauty in the world. I don't know about you, but I love this season of the year, don't you? For me, the sight of the first snowdrops are one of the first signs of the recurring goodness of God. That although the world is crazy and mixed up, still there is something extremely good in this world. I've got to confess that I've pulled the curtain to hide out some of the sunlight, but in the window behind me is a lovely plant that Sharon wants you to notice. If you can't see it, just take my word that it's there. It's a lovely Christmas cactus that's just suddenly bloomed, burst out with buds. It's a maze of colour. And if I pull the curtain back even further, there's a lovely pot of daffodils. You know, Sharon has really gone to town in making a wonderful backcloth for me today. And I'm such a naughty boy that I've pulled the curtain over it so that you can see my ugly face a little bit better. But it's a sign of the colour and the beauty and the wonderful things that are in creation. Do you know, when I first prepared this series, little did I think that we would be seeing the horrors of war in Ukraine, hourly, moment by moment, on our screens. And the question has been raised, I'm sure, by many of us, and I know I've certainly asked this question, why, when God purportedly is in control, is there so much suffering and brokenness in the world? Now, the book of Job is a unique story. What we must avoid doing is saying everything in the book of Job is relevant to us today. I'm sure that there are aspects of the story of Job that are peculiar to his situation. And it reminds me, when I speak to someone, it's very unwise for me to say, I know exactly how you feel. It's not true, is it? In a way, you can't enter into my experience any more than I can enter into your experience. We can sit here and say this afternoon that's common sense. But you would be surprised how often we're tempted to give glib answers when we're confronted by people who are really going through it. Just before I came out today, I contacted a colleague who's retired like me from the Baptist ministry. And I wanted to speak to him because I've just heard the news that his wife and mother of his 6 children has been diagnosed with recurring breast cancer. She had it 25 years ago and was successfully treated, but now right out of the blue it's suddenly come back. And he said to me when I phoned him, "We're being very open and honest about this." He said, "We realise that our time together is very limited and we're trying to make the most of that time." He said, "I'm withdrawing from public ministry for at least the time being." It would have been a mistake for me to have said, "I know exactly how you feel." Because the reality is I don't know exactly how he feels. And when my own wife was going through the final stages of leukemia, he was a great supporter to me, but he never made the mistake of pretending that he knew exactly what my experience was at that time. Let's not take the book of Job as a blueprint, as a pattern for all instances of suffering. The book of Job is a big book. It's also an old book. It deals with a universal problem. But in one sense, it's also a unique book because it's Job's experience and his alone. You just try and imagine the kind of grief that lies behind that first chapter. I mean, it's almost comical, isn't it? The way these disasters happen one after another. It's exaggerated. It's almost as if it's a caricature of experience. How one messenger comes hot on the heels of another messenger, bringing news of a fresh disaster. Perhaps the greatest disaster is when Job loses all 10 of his children. Now, one thing I do not know about is the grief that comes when you lose one of your children. My mother knew that grief. When my sister was just 28, she died suddenly from an asthma attack. And my mother, who'd lost my father 8 years before, said to me on one occasion, "Neil, it was bad enough losing your dad, but I think losing Sheila has hurt even more." One of the wonderful heroes of the Victorian Church was Archbishop Tate. He became Archbishop of Canterbury, but before he was appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, he was Dean of Carlisle. And during his time at Carlisle, he and his wife, within the space of about 6 weeks, lost 5 of their 6 children to the dreaded disease of TB. In fact, Archbishop Tate was reputed to be Queen Victoria's favourite archbishop, and she had 6, so she got plenty to choose from. But the reason why she felt an empathy with Archbishop Tate was because she herself had suffered the premature death of her husband. So we've got to avoid translating Job's experience into common experience. His experience in that sense is universal, but it's also unique. So I'm going to leave it there, and Sharon is going to open up the various sites, and I'm going to invite you to raise issues that perhaps you've discovered as you've read the book of Job in the past.